This is the Analysis in Chains with Nathan Williams and Neil Kieran.
Welcome to Analysis in Chains. I'm Nathan Williams, and joining me today is Chris Tse from Cardstack. Chris, thank you for joining me today. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. Nice to be here.
So, Chris, Cardstack is a really interesting prospect. The idea of decentralization of apps. Could you tell us just a bit how you came to this idea, this project, and what you're doing exactly?
Absolutely. And I think this project, the Cardstack project, actually started as an idea or a reaction against the centralization of like Facebook and the app silos. That, you need 45 apps on your phone to do anything, and you have to switch between different ecosystem and different logins and different regimes of digital superpower controlling those apps. And I felt that was something that was going wrong, even as early as 2014. So I went around the New York City meetup community, to the design community, the tech community, the programming community, and the cultural community, and say, we need to stack the deck against this increased centralization of Silicon Valley. And that was kind of an idea about, taking the apps apart, reassembling them in these small units called cards, and then chaining together workflow that's for the user. Now, mind I tell you, this was before the blockchain, for sure. This is before Silicon Valley, the parody that made it clear that this is a real problem. And certainly before any of the Facebook, Cambridge Analytica stuff, the reckoning that happened 4 years later. So there was a genesis of this idea being important, and we kind of kept working on it, figure out what it is all about, working on the front end technology, thinking about how APIs can work together without having to lock you into certain logins and certain developer program. They can shut you down any given time. What does that really mean? So we've been working towards that in the open source work we did. So that's kind of one aspect of it.
Yeah, well, when I was reading up on Cardstack, correct me if I'm wrong, but the way I understood it is that there are different cards or different essentially components of apps that are frequently reused. And your idea is to sort of decentralize them so that people can put them together and make whatever apps they want, or that are powered by blockchain. Is that more or less correct?
Yeah, I think the key here is that there's a lot of services that you need that someone needs to maintain. Like if someone is doing a podcast service, someone will have to kind of deal with writing the software for encoding. That's always going to be necessary. But if I'm building a entity that has podcasts and have content and a Medium style article and white papers and academic paper, right now I basically have to point people to 7 different centralized services for that consumer to be able to see the full view that I put together. And Card UI only means that each one of those things can still go to their storage utility, and that could obviously switch to decentralized storage in the future. But as an end user, as a curator, as a producer, as a person who is telling a story, I want to be able to put those cards together and say, this is my story. Now, obviously, people do this with WordPress and short codes and kind of embedding it kind of clunkily. But I believe, and we believe, that if we make it that much easier for people to assemble cards from different origins, backed by either centralized services to start to kind of bring those together and curate them. But in the future, as we have decentralized services come to the blockchain, they're going to need users. They're going to need ways to get into people's lives. And that's really difficult today. But if cards already exist and someone is building a new decentralized YouTube, it'll be much easier for them to say, let me make this application into a component, into a card, and allow users who are already connecting to each other using Cardstack to add that one component into the workflow. Now, obviously, we will work out how we compensate if there's like hosting involved in it, if there is tokens involved in it, and there's royalties that we want to pay to the people who contributed involved in it. We have to work that out. And that's the second part of Cardstack, is the economics and metering billing model. But if we just think about from an open source point of view, it'll be great for those new features and cards to be flow into the user's existing compositing workflow, and they're essentially in control of that assembly, and they're not at the whim of, I assemble everything within Slack and I'm locked into the Slack platform. And if it's hard to switch, or I'm locked into my OS or locked into Facebook newsfeed and my Farmville app, we want that assembly to be owned by the user. The orchestration is in control of the user. And that's at the end of the day what decentralized is really about. It's about the re-centralization of the digital lives of the users around the user's own sovereignty.
It's interesting, isn't it, that ever since the beginning of the internet, the dream has been decentralization. But what ended up happening was actually a centralization of services where a few big companies ended up winning and controlling the day. And when you're thinking of Airbnb or Facebook or Uber or any of these, YouTube, any of these companies, it comes down to the need of a central investment entity of making large piles of money and an inability to fund open source projects. I mean, the only real success story in that was Wikipedia.
Yes.
But it's almost like blockchain is this decentralized payment ability because you now have the ability to fund these decentral projects that have various people as part of a team, because now you have a way of people integrating with that, of people signing off on different parts, of having decentralized governance as well.
Yeah.
And I guess this is what we should expect to see going forward, is this is more and more decentralized services.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're already seeing an explosion of different ideas of essentially, decentralized version of something that has already been centralized, whether it's marketplaces or media distribution system or insurance and finance, obviously, with the genesis of Bitcoin around that push back against the financial institutions. We see a lot of that. But I think one of the real irony about decentralization is that decentralization kind of naturally leads to fragmentation, right? When you decentralize something, you make more of something, and then there's more choices. Which wallet do you use? Which token do you use for this? And which dApp do you use for that? And then eventually that inhibits growth, right? Centralization is kind of convenient, right? If you say everybody agrees that we're going to use Facebook Connect or Facebook Login, it does reduce the friction for adoption. Now, it does create this privacy debt that we're still trying to figure out what comes on. But, we think that we need decentralization we need aggregation. We need some sort of synthesis without centralization. And that's really what is the kind of challenge. It's that decentralization is not easy, but it's doable, right? You just repeat things and build something in better protocols and build a crypto economics around a video, community or around a certain marketplace. But how do you make people discover it and find it and be able to get into it? And that's really the biggest risk. Every single time you make something easy to use, that thing, that on-ramp, that aggregation point becomes a centralization risk. The web is pretty decentralized. Everybody has their own website. Everybody has their own box running HTML and stuff like that. But nobody can find anything. So two people from Stanford drop out and say, I can build a better search engine. Mm-hmm. And that became Google. And it was not evil for a long time, and possibly still not evil by intent, but we'll see the results of it in its final analysis. But that's a centralization vector that because that usability layer is so desirable and so powerful as a way to get people in, once you do that, that becomes a place where that power can be centralized and attention can be divvied up and ads can be bidded, and the same thing happened with Facebook with the fact that it's just sharing things and some articles, and then that becomes shaping people's minds. So we want to acknowledge that for decentralized software to be useful, we need to combine them and assemble them and make it easy to get on. But we have to make sure whatever that is designed from its core to be decentralized as well. So aggregation without centralization is not only a opportunity, we see that, and we see Cardstack playing a role in that, but it's also a really important kind of principle to keep in our mind, is that someone in a business, in a market of massive innovation will come and say, let me just package all of this and bundle it up and make it easier for average people to do. And if that person doesn't have the same principle in mind as the blockchain community that's early adopter who have this principle, that person will become the future Zuckerberg of this field, just as easily as the web with Tim Berners-Lee's vision became Sergey and Larry's version of it. So we got to look out for these things and see that it's important to get that on-ramp, but we have to be careful to make sure we architect the on-ramp and basically sign a pact of covenants in smart contract, hopefully, that this centralization layer will still fairly distribute its wealth, its opportunity, its attention for all the people that's going to contribute to this now and in the future.
Absolutely. Oh, absolutely. When you talk about this idea of a centralized on-ramp, if you think about it, even Bitcoin has some level of centralization. The question isn't what should it be centralized or decentralized? The question is, what parts can we trust to be centralized? With Bitcoin, the protocol, everyone has to use the same protocol. That's in a way centralized. It's organized by a core group of developers, and people can, in a way it's decentralized, but there's a group of people that all have to come to a common agreement on what that protocol is going to be. Otherwise, you end up getting fragmentation, where you've got if someone chooses a different protocol, then they're suddenly Litecoin or Bitcoin Cash or a completely different group. And I think that you're exactly right. When you have central core principles that you're adhering to, that a group is adhering to, it's slightly different than if you're controlling the money.
Yes.
Or if you're controlling the data or controlling the on-ramp. And that's what we have to be careful of, I think, when dealing with centralization.
Absolutely. And I think, when we look at Bitcoin as a case study of something that kind of worked in a way that probably people didn't expect. And I think it's not really about centralization or decentralization in Bitcoin as much as there is a clear separation of power. Bitcoin Core has a certain amount of power. The mining network and the pool has a certain amount of power. The users certainly have some amount of power. I think what we see the politics played out in the last year is that somebody win on something forked, something didn't fork. Those are all kind of just results of this separation of power within the Bitcoin economy or ecosystem kind of play itself out. Now, again, we can design these, if we're looking at the future version where it's not just about a single currency, it's about multiple protocol and dApps and coming together. We're seeing mechanical projects trying to cross-chain communication. But at the end of the day, once the plumbing is done, we still have to figure out, who holds which group in what governance model hold influence over what part of the ecosystem. My feeling is that if you have 4 or 5 parties that have influence over an outcome, that's already better than Mark Zuckerberg having influence over all the outcomes. That's already better than centralization. So even though there might be some kind of clustering of power within a decentralized ecosystem, as long as there's a multitude of people, I think we're already better off. But if we're even more thoughtful about how to slice the responsibility up with stake pools, with ideas of protocol that can be governed on chain. These are all great ways to further redistribute the power to the people who are actually fostering and growing the networks.
It's going to continue to be for sure a problem that the whole community wrestles with going forward, because there's no clear answer to centralization, decentralization, what level people need to engage with. But I think it's going to be a danger on the right road of trying to choose which level of centralization, which level of decentralization. We're speaking with Chris Tse, the founder and head of product at Cardstack. Chris, I want to change gears a little bit, and I want to talk, because you guys have been around since 2014.
Right.
You're based in New York. You've sort of seen the gamut of people getting excited about blockchain, Bitcoin, crypto, people sort of losing interest and people coming back in. How do we get people on board with blockchain in the long run? How do we get regular people to really adopt this the way they did the internet?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the hype cycle that came and gone with cryptocurrency earlier, and then blockchain, enterprise blockchain, and then now that kind of fades out. And now there was a little bit of growth in the last year on just Bitcoin again, the prices. The truth is that most people who are kind of trying to go about their lives or digital lives, Bitcoin and blockchain technology and ERC20 and Ethereum is really something that they've never actually seen and played with. And the great thing is that they will one day encounter it. The bad news is that when they do encounter it, it's a terrible experience. They don't understand what is going on with all these plugins and all these wallets and things that you're supposed to use and not use, and all the tokens and the symbols, and why do you have to check?
Yeah,
and why does
you remember back in did you code in the early days of the internet, like 1994, 95, when the only people that could make a website were like professional coders? Like,
absolutely. Yeah, I wrote a piece of a Perl code that was giving a date
oh my gosh,
on
you're a Perl
Citibank.com. Yeah, on Citibank.com. Like, it was like, I can't believe this. I'm like an intern, and at Citibank.com is running a piece of Perl code that I wrote, and that was really hard, right? It was something that cost millions of dollars just to get a basic like brochureware site. Not to mention anything with login is like, oh, then you need like a team of 20 people.
Oh yeah,
and so I think we're there now, right? So we have caught up to the point where you can get a bunch of people writing Solidity. I'm not saying Solidity is Perl, but it is something that you need to really understand how the EVM works and how you can get it to do something seemingly quite basic, but going through this kind of rigorous process of not only for security reason, but also thinking about gas usage and how much it will cost and would it finish and is it efficient. I personally believe that those are important kind of building blocks for this future decentralized movement. But let's be honest, even if we were able to compel 2 million, 5 million, 10 million people that would be otherwise using a iOS app to, coordinate some travel, to say, hey, let's use a decentralized travel app, that will take down the blockchain from a transactional volume point of view, more so than CryptoKitty was ever do. Because the truth is that scalability is not there, but usability is actually much worse. People don't really understand why they need to go through 7 different steps just to prepare themselves to be able to click one button to like do a booking or something like that. You need to have the token. You have to have a wallet. Your wallet probably needs to be a hardware wallet. So we believe that this idea of any type of these steps that you need to do before you do anything, please do these 7 things. All those 7 things basically have to be eliminated. Right? So that the first thing you do is to do something useful and real, watch a thing, pay a person, book a thing, without all these kind of preparation. And that, to me, is the real challenge, is that a lot of the work in improving the user experience of product in crypto is about what I call beautifying the cryptography, making the steps nicer and more friendly and slicker, but there's not about removing the steps. Like, we still want people to go through. You got to know what an address is. You have to create in the wallet. We'll make that process a lot easier. But what if we don't need wallets? What if we don't need to see the tokens? What if we, like a car nowadays, you press the start-stop button and then everything is done? Back in the days, you have to go in the front of the car and crank it and prime it and stuff like that. That's all gone. So I think a lot of the ceremony that we do in using and buying and selling and trying to use decentralized app that's backed by token are actually those steps, those priming and cranking step of early internal combustion engine. And what we want is auto start stop. What we want is walk by the car door opens, you sit down and you start driving. And better yet, it may start driving you. So, and this is the real challenge about the blockchain world, is that a lot of the blockchain teams, the dApps teams, are still led by the technical founders. And these are the technical founders who created this the concept, designed the protocol, and they want people to experience what their engine, what their thing they built is doing. right? And so when a design comes to them, it's like, why do they care about tokens at all? Why don't I just click here and then start using it? And they say, well, you can't do that because you have to understand addresses and wallets. And that tension, which is that they want you to experience the creation, is causing this kind of inability for a design team to come in and say, let's just have one button on and off. And I think we need to really simplify to that point before the mass market can adopt, whether they want to or not. It's just too complicated, too much drop-off potential.
Absolutely. I heard the phrase that's going around the community, at least around here, is that the average person doesn't care about decentralization. They don't want decentralization. What they want is well-managed infrastructure.
Right.
People want to be able to trust that when they use their bank, they use whatever, that it works properly. The early adopters are the ones that are the crypto anarchists that really care about who controls their tokens or their services. And it's sort of hard to move beyond that early adopter phase into what the mass market wants without having some sort of well-regulated infrastructure where people can just sort of say, okay, well, I trust this exchange, I trust this this service that they're going to handle my tokens properly, and I don't have to think about whether it's my private keys or someone else's my private keys, or if what happens if I lose my tokens.
Yeah.
But honestly, like with it's that crossing the chasm between those early adopters and the early majority that's going to be the biggest challenge, and just
Absolutely.
like it was with the internet.
Certainly. And, what we're doing at Cardstack more than anything else is figuring out how to work backwards from what the mass market, the users coming in late is going to expect. And their expectation is high, right? Because we're in the post-iPhone, post-Android, everything is beautiful with onboarding process. So we need to see what do they need to be successful. And I think the key here is that initially they don't care about decentralization at all. So you want to make it so that you can meet them where they are. Hey, go to this website, log in, and you start using this crypto accounting system or this portfolio management system. Let's say that's what we're building. It could be anything. And then what we want to be able to offer to them is by designing the framework correctly. When that user say, I would like to now take ownership of my private keys. I understand that now I bought a Trezor. Awesome, right? Then you'll be able to say, okay, now take step 2. I'm going to transfer the custodial key that this cloud hosted application is doing and then transfer it to you. Now this become more like a blockchain.info where we don't have your keys anymore. And then later on, they say, you know what? I really want to have the data on my own machine or my own cloud that I control. I say, okay, let me shift all the preference data away from this multi-tenant system and to your kind of hardware or your control cloud. And then later on, they say, oh, I can only trust myself if I run my own node in my basement with some GPU. Say, okay, now we can help you move that to this rig that you built, that you bought from Newegg. That's progressive decentralization, bringing people to greater sovereignty without ever changing the user experience, without requiring them to start over. And all the while, every piece of software that they're using, and the reason we can move them off this centralized service into this kind of decentralized kind of rig that you build is because they're all open source. And Cardstack is really building that. We're trying to create a situation where all the software is necessary to deploy peer-to-peer on a local machine on your personal cloud where you control all the databases and lists and stuff like that, or in a multi-tenant way so it's easy to get on-ramp, actually built on the same code on the Cardstack framework, and it's compensated and coordinated through the same token mechanism. But because we can do it in this like 3 different ways, we can switch people back and forth between these different, call it deployment model, without saying that, oh, because Coinbase is easy to use, I'm going to use Coinbase and now I'm locked into the ecosystem. I can never take it out. Or I want to do it a decentralized way, but I want to access it while I'm on vacation and I don't have access to this rig and then you can't get in. So this idea of fluid movement through a common software framework and a common billing model through a token mechanism really allows us to flex the muscle later on to say, let's capture the user's imagination attention through places that they know how to visit, like apps and websites, and then knowing that those apps and websites are built on the same tool in an open source way, so they will always have competition from people running it themselves. But allowing those to simultaneously exist is probably a very important substrate to allow the experimentation of what's the best way to ensure that people go to the level of decentralization they need and they want, while building this continuous network effects without that centralization vector at charge where a monopoly can take over. And that's really, at the end of the day, what we're trying to do.
That makes total sense. Now, one last thing before we wrap up. If I'm a developer, how do I get started with Cardstack?
So we've been open source for a long time, and the latest kind of project, the repository is at github.com/cardstack/cardstack. It's a monorepo, so we put all the plugins. I think it's like up to 35 plugins. That's part of the Cardstack system, kind of for all to see, to assemble together. Now, obviously, developer looking at those things will say, oh, I see how these middleware is working together, different plugins interact. But it's even for developers, once the UI is there and they can click through it, they get a better understanding of what's going on underneath. So in the next 3 or 4 weeks, we're going to release more UI code that sits on top of the Cardstack Hub, which is our core kind of deployment and integration framework. And those framework, for example, adapt to Ethereum. We have adapters to Hyperledger we've done in previous projects. And we anticipate that we'll write plugins, or better yet, the community will write plugins for Cardstack for basically all the useful dApps and protocol that people want to be able to orchestrate for this end user experience, right? So that's already available, and we're going to do more training series and guides to get people involved. The goal here is to not have developers do the heavy lifting and say, here's a pile of protocol and software, go make something useful. What we're going to do is deliver end user experience the developer can launch to their users, and then be able to allow them to customize and augment and extend the Cardstack framework in an open source way. So we're starting to do this end user packaging for the purpose of developer. So one way we look at it is that what's one of the most successful open source project of all time? And people say, oh, Linux and stuff like that. It's all true. But actually it's WordPress, because end user can use it, they install it, and they suddenly run into a problem and say, I want to add some features, and developer can come in and help a little bit, or you can build a whole company to build real product on top of WordPress ecosystem. It's not highbrow. It's not as esoteric as like, oh, I'm doing some deployment stuff on the cloud, but it's still like 30% of the traffic on the web is on WordPress. We want Cardstack to be as ubiquitous, as friendly, as easy to on-ramp as WordPress, but for the decentralized world. And that's what we're aiming to do, and adding really nice adapters and connections that allow this decentralized vision to become real, but not just real in an esoteric sense, but really massively distributed. And on every web host or every cloud provider would allow you to run a Cardstack app and get started and experience what decentralization and blockchain is all about, maybe in the beginning without even knowing it.
That's absolutely fascinating. I wish you all the success. Thank you for joining me today. Chris Tse is the founder of Cardstack. They've got a whole platform for doing decentralization on the blockchain. Chris, best of luck.
Thank you so much.